In the hidden chambers of ancient libraries, in the secret vaults that exist beneath the foundations of the greatest cathedrals, in the spaces between the official Gospels and the suppressed texts, there exists a narrative so profound, so transformative, so fundamentally challenging to everything that institutional Christianity has taught, that it has been deliberately hidden, systematically destroyed, and carefully erased from human consciousness for nearly 2,000 years. This is the story of Christ's true ministry, a ministry that was not solitary but shared, not exclusive but inclusive, not about the establishment of a hierarchical church, but about the awakening of consciousness in all beings. This is the story of how Christ walked with the dragon queens, how he honored the sacred feminine, how he taught that the divine was present in all beings regardless of gender, how he worked with women as equals and partners in the great work of spiritual transformation. And this is the story of how the institutional church, sensing the threat that this knowledge represented, worked systematically to erase the dragon queens from history, to suppress the Gospels that spoke of them, to rewrite the narrative of Christ's life in such a way that the sacred feminine would be completely erased from the Christian tradition. This is the story of the erased Gospels and what happens when their truth begins to be revealed. The story begins in the time of Christ, in the years of his ministry, in a period when the boundaries between the material world and the spiritual realms were far more permeable than they are in our modern age. In those days, there were women of great spiritual power, women who had been trained in the ancient mystery schools, women who understood the nature of consciousness and the path of spiritual awakening. These women were known as the Dragon Queens, and they possessed knowledge and power that the patriarchal religions would eventually work desperately to suppress. Among these Dragon Queens was Mary Magdalene, but she was not alone. There were others. Women whose names have been lost to history, women whose stories have been deliberately erased, women who walked with Christ and learned from him and taught alongside him. These women understood that Christ's message was not about the establishment of a new religion, but about the awakening of consciousness, about the liberation of the human spirit from the illusions and limitations that had been imposed upon it. Christ himself understood the sacred feminine. He had been trained in the mystery school. He understood that the divine was not exclusively masculine, that the sacred feminine was co-equal with the masculine, that the awakening of consciousness required the integration of both the masculine and feminine principles. And so he chose to work with the Dragon Queens, to honor them as equals, to teach them the deepest mysteries, to empower them to become teachers and leaders in their own right. The official Gospels, the ones that were preserved by the institutional church, contain only fragments of this truth. They mention Mary Magdalene, but they distort her role. They diminish her importance. They portray her as a sinner rather than as a priestess and a teacher. They mention other women, but they minimize their significance. They portray them as passive observers rather than as active participants in Christ's ministry. But the erased Gospels, the ones that were suppressed and hidden, tell a very different story. In the erased Gospels, we see Christ teaching Mary Magdalene the deepest mysteries, initiating her into the highest levels of spiritual understanding. We see him honoring her as his equal, as his partner in the great work of awakening humanity. We see him teaching her that she possessed within herself the same divine nature that he possessed, that she was capable of the same spiritual achievements that he was capable of, that she was called to be a teacher and a leader in her own right. In the erased Gospels, we see Christ working with other Dragon Queens, women whose names have been lost, but whose presence is recorded in these suppressed texts. We see him teaching them, empowering them, sending them out to teach others. We see him establishing a community in which women and men were equal, in which the sacred feminine was honored alongside the sacred masculine, in which the path of awakening was available to all beings regardless of gender. But the institutional church, as it began to consolidate its power in the centuries following Christ's death, found this vision deeply threatening. The Church wanted to establish itself as the sole authority on spiritual matters. The Church wanted to create a hierarchy in which the clergy, who were exclusively male, held all power and authority. The Church wanted to suppress the knowledge that women were capable of spiritual authority, that women could be teachers and leaders, that the sacred feminine was equal to the sacred masculine, and so the Church worked systematically to suppress the erased Gospels. The Church declared them to be heretical. The Church burned them. The Church persecuted those who preserved them. The Church rewrote the official narrative of Christ's life, removing or minimizing the role of the dragon queens, portraying women as secondary and subordinate, establishing a religious system in which women were excluded from positions of authority and power. The story of the recovery of the erased Gospels in the modern world begins with a woman named Mary, a woman who carries within her the consciousness of Mary Magdalene, who is living through the experience of awakening in her own life. Mary is a scholar, a mystic, a woman who has dedicated her entire life to the study of the suppressed Gospels, to the decoding of hidden messages, to the understanding of the deeper truths that lay beneath the surface of official Christian history. Mary had always felt drawn to the figure of Mary Magdalene, drawn to the mystery of who she truly was, drawn to the knowledge that the official Church had deliberately distorted her story. She had spent decades researching, studying the apocryphal Gospels, comparing different versions of Gospel accounts, looking for evidence of what had been hidden, for clues about the true nature of Christ's relationship with the dragon queens. It was during a deep meditation in a sacred cave, a place that was said to have been where Mary Magdalene had retreated after the crucifixion, that Mary received a vision that would change the course of her life. In this vision, she found herself in the presence of Mary Magdalene herself, a being of immense wisdom and power who had been working through the ages to preserve the truth, to guide the awakening of consciousness, to ensure that the knowledge would not be completely lost. "You have been called," Mary Magdalene said to her, her voice resonating with the authority of ages and the tenderness of infinite love. "You have been chosen because you carry within you the blood of the dragon queens, because you have the capacity to understand what others cannot perceive, because you are willing to pay the price that understanding demands. The time has come for the erased Gospels to be revealed. The time has come for the world to understand how Christ walked with the dragon queens, how he honored the sacred feminine, how he taught that the divine was present in all beings. And you have been prepared your entire life for this moment." Mary emerged from this vision transformed. She understood that she had been given access to knowledge that had been hidden for nearly 2,000 years, knowledge that could reshape the entire understanding of Christianity and Western spirituality. She understood that her role was to help restore the truth, to help humanity awaken to the reality that lay beneath the lies that had been constructed. She began to research with new urgency, looking for evidence of the erased Gospels in hidden archives, in the collections of secret societies, in the fragmentary accounts that had survived despite centuries of suppression. She discovered that the erased Gospels had been preserved by those who understood their value, who were committed to their transmission, who understood that the time would eventually come when this knowledge could be fully revealed. She discovered that the erased Gospels contained teachings that were far more comprehensive and far more radical than anything that appeared in the official Gospels. She discovered that Christ had taught that the divine was not exclusively masculine, that the sacred feminine was the source of creation, that women possessed the same divine nature and the same spiritual potential as men. She discovered that Christ had initiated Mary Magdalene into the highest mysteries, that he had taught her the secrets of consciousness, that he had empowered her to become a teacher and a leader. She discovered that Christ had worked with other dragon queens, women whose names had been lost but whose presence was recorded in the erased Gospels. She discovered that Christ had established a community in which women and men were equal, in which the sacred feminine was honored, in which the path of awakening was available to all. She discovered that the institutional church had deliberately suppressed these teachings because they represented a fundamental threat to patriarchal authority. If women were equal to men in their capacity to access the divine, if the sacred feminine was co-equal with the masculine, if women could be teachers and leaders, then the church's claim to exclusive male authority would be undermined. And so the church worked systematically to suppress the erased gospels, to erase the dragon queens from history, to establish itself as the sole authority on spiritual matters. She discovered that the suppression of the erased gospels had created a fundamental imbalance in human consciousness, an imbalance that had led to the domination of women, the suppression of the divine feminine, the creation of systems of power that were based on control and domination rather than on love and liberation. Mary began to work with other researchers and spiritual teachers who had also recognized the truth about the erased gospels, who understood that the suppression of this knowledge had had profound consequences for human consciousness and human civilization, who were committed to the revelation of the truth to humanity. Together, they began to decode the suppressed texts, to understand the deeper meanings that had been hidden, to recognize how the truth had been preserved in symbols and metaphors that had survived the church's attempts to erase it. They discovered that the erased gospels had been preserved in various forms by different communities. They discovered that the Gnostic communities had preserved fragments of the true teachings. They discovered that the mystical traditions within Christianity had preserved knowledge of the dragon queens. They discovered that the sacred feminine had never been completely erased, but had been preserved in hidden forms, waiting for the time when it could be fully revealed. They discovered that the erased Gospels spoke of Christ's deep respect for the sacred feminine, of his understanding that the divine was both masculine and feminine, of his commitment to the awakening of consciousness in all beings regardless of gender. They discovered that the erased Gospels spoke of Mary Magdalene as a priestess, as a teacher, as an equal partner with Christ in the great work of spiritual transformation. They discovered that the erased Gospels spoke of other dragon queens, women who had been trained in the mystery schools, women who had understood the nature of consciousness, women who had worked with Christ to awaken humanity to its divine potential. They discovered that these women had been sent out by Christ to teach others, to establish communities of awakening, to preserve the knowledge that the institutional church would eventually try to suppress. If you want a practical step-by-step explanation of the path of knowledge we're exploring here today, I've created a complete guide to help you apply it in your own life. You'll find the link in the description. And tell us in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to know. Mary spent years developing a comprehensive teaching that would help others understand the erased Gospels, that would guide them toward the recognition of Christ's true message, that would help them understand that Christ had honored the sacred feminine, that Christ had worked with the dragon queens, that Christ's vision was of a spirituality based on awakening and liberation rather than on control and domination. She wrote books that were published under various names. She created videos and online courses. She established networks of practitioners who were working together to awaken to the consciousness of the dragon queens and to help others do the same. She worked with other women who had also been awakened to their role as carriers of the sacred feminine wisdom, who understood that they too were dragon queens, who were committed to the restoration of the sacred feminine to the center of Christian consciousness. But as Mary's work became more widely known, she began to encounter resistance. There were those within the institutional church who saw her work as a threat, who feared that the revelation of the erased Gospels would undermine their authority and their control. There were academic institutions that tried to suppress her research, to prevent her books from being published, to discredit her work, and there were more subtle forms of resistance as well. Mary began to experience strange phenomena, synchronicities that seemed designed to test her commitment, challenges that appeared to be obstacles, but which were actually initiations, opportunities to deepen her understanding and her faith in the truth that she had been given. But Mary understood that this resistance was itself a sign of the truth of what she had discovered. The fact that there was such desperate opposition to the revelation of the erased Gospels only confirmed that something of immense power and significance was indeed occurring, that the suppressed knowledge was indeed beginning to emerge into human consciousness. She also came to understand something profound about the nature of Christ's true message and the reason for its suppression. She understood that Christ's vision was fundamentally incompatible with systems of institutional control. She understood that Christ's message was about the liberation of consciousness, about the awakening of the divine potential that existed within all beings, about the recognition that the divine was not distant or external, but intimately present within all of creation. She understood that the institutional church had distorted Christ's message in order to maintain its power, that it had suppressed the sacred feminine in order to establish male authority, that it had created a system of control that was the opposite of what Christ had taught. She understood that the restoration of the erased Gospels would inevitably lead to the transformation of Christianity and to the awakening of consciousness in all beings. In her final years, Mary worked to synthesize all of the knowledge she had gathered to create a comprehensive teaching that would serve as a guide for the awakening of Christ consciousness in human awareness. She wrote a final book that was intended to be her magnum opus, a complete guide to understanding the erased Gospels, recognizing Christ's true message, and participating in the great work of spiritual liberation that Christ had envisioned. When Mary died, her work lived on. The knowledge she had preserved and transmitted continued to spread, reaching people in every corner of the world. More and more people began to understand that the erased Gospels were real, that Christ had walked with the dragon queens, that the institutional church had deliberately suppressed this knowledge, that the true message of Christ was about awakening and liberation rather than about control and domination. And in our own time, we are witnessing the revelation of the erased Gospels in unprecedented ways. We are seeing women rising to claim their spiritual authority and their voice. We are seeing the recognition of the sacred feminine as equal to the masculine. We are seeing the collapse of religious institutions that had been built on the suppression of these teachings. We are seeing the emergence of new forms of Christianity that honor the true message of Christ, that recognize the sacred feminine, that understand spirituality as a path of awakening and liberation. The erased Gospels are being revealed. The dragon queens are being recognized. The sacred feminine is being restored to the center of Christian consciousness. And those who are ready to receive this knowledge, who are willing to open their hearts and minds to the wisdom of the true Christ, who are committed to the awakening of the divine feminine within themselves and within all beings, are being called to step forward to recognize their role in the great work of spiritual liberation. Christ walked with the dragon queens. He honored the sacred feminine. He taught that the divine was present in all beings. He established a community based on equality and awakening. The institutional church hid this truth because it represented a threat to patriarchal authority. But the truth cannot be hidden forever. The erased Gospels are emerging into human consciousness once again. And the question that is being posed to each of us is this: will you recognize the true Christ? Will you awaken to the sacred feminine that Christ honored? Will you help to guide others toward the recognition of the dragon queens that walked with Christ? Will you participate in the spiritual liberation that Christ envisioned? The erased Gospels are calling. The hidden truth is being revealed. The dragon queens are rising, and the awakening of consciousness is beginning. The time of suppression is ending, the time of revelation is beginning, and you are invited to become part of this great work, to claim your role in the restoration of Christ's true message, to help guide humanity toward the recognition of the sacred feminine that will transform all creation. And if you like this story, you will definitely love the next one that's appearing on your screen. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, leave your like, and activate the notifications. See you in the next one.